Greetings, folks! Welcome back to part 2 of Amenities and Economic Development. In the first video, we learned that, along with knowing how to party, California ranks very high for amenities. But what exactly are amenities? In the first video, we defined amenities as features of places that provide enjoyment or comfort. Amenities are believed to attract households to a region, and they're also important to tourists when seeking out a place to visit. We learned in the last video that mild winters are good for the economic development of U.S. regions, but there are a wide range of non-climate amenities, such as low crime, proximity to the ocean and/or mountains, recreational opportunities, and simply fun things to do. There are a couple of ways to examine the importance of amenities to regions. First, some studies have analyzed the effects of amenities on population growth, employment growth, and even incomes. And these studies often uncover a positive relationship between these indicators of regional economic activity and the presence of amenities. Other studies use what's called the hedonic approach to analyzing amenities, which is based on the premise that amenities are actually priced into local wages and housing values. The idea here is that people will trade off lower wages and higher housing costs to live in amenity-rich areas. If this is the case, the local labor and housing markets will temper the effects of amenities on indicators such as population growth. As a reminder of what we learned in the last video about climate and economic development, here's a figure that summarizes the effects of January temperature on the employment, income, and persistence indices, as well as the overall economic development index. The height of the bars represents the size of the impact in terms of standard deviations when we increase the average January low temperature by 1 standard deviation. The last bar, labeled as Economic Development Index, tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in a metropolitan area's average January low temperature corresponds with about a 0.15 standard deviation increase in the Economic Development Index. The bars are shaded in red to indicate results that are statistically significant. We see here that a pleasant winter climate positively impacts the growth of regions as measured by the employment index. Also, places with a nice winter climate have more persistent employment over time. In other words, less ups and downs that are typically found in places that rely on lots of tourists during the summer, but fewer visitors in the winter. This makes sense because if the winter has nice weather, a place is less apt to have as big of a contrast between the number of summer and wintertime tourists. Finally, the results show that the income index is lower in places with warmer winter temperatures. This is consistent with the idea that lower incomes are the price we pay for nice weather. Now, let's look at some non-climate amenities. If you asked 50 different people to list off their top amenities, you would probably get 50 different answers. But for our purposes, we'll look at the amenities of low crime, arts and recreation businesses, restaurants and bars, and bookstores and music stores. You might be wondering why I would count music stores as an amenity, because most people these days get their music online. But keep in mind that the economic development indicators measure the growth of good jobs in a region from 1990 to the mid-2010s. So the idea is to look at how regional characteristics way back in 1990 affected economic development moving forward. And back in 1990, we still had lots of music stores. And to show you how old I am and how cool I used to be, I would reward myself for doing well on a test in school by purchasing a new music CD from a local record store. For our first non-climate amenity, we'll look at the effects of violent crime rates on economic development. And I should point out that I've scaled crime rates so that places with higher crime have lower values. So a positive effect would mean that regions with lower violent crime rates did better for economic development. As usual, the bar height represents the size of the impact in terms of standard deviations when we increase the crime rate variable, again suggesting lower crime, by 1 standard deviation. And I shade the bars to indicate results that are statistically significant. Since none of the bars are shaded, we see that there's not a statistically significant effect of violent crime rates on the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas. And this result holds when you focus on large metros with 1 million or more people and small metros with less than 1 million residents. In other words, crime rates don't affect the economic development of metropolitan areas one way or another. And I should point out that this result is likely driven by the fact that the economic development indicators measure conditions across an entire metropolitan area, which in some places encompasses numerous counties. While in many cities and metros, violent crimes are geographically concentrated to certain areas within the larger region. So it's almost certainly the case that crime affects, or is perhaps a reflection of, economic conditions in the high crime areas. It's just that the conditions in these high crime areas do not translate into large enough effects that we pick up when studying entire metropolitan areas. For our next set of non-climate amenities, we'll look at businesses that give people something to do. It could be businesses in the arts and recreation, restaurants and bars, or even music and bookstores. But before we look at how these types of businesses, which are thought of as amenities to some people, affect economic development, let's think about the extent to which these businesses are geographically concentrated versus spread out across the entire country. Restaurants and bars are pretty much ubiquitous. This means that you can find these types of businesses just about everywhere and in roughly equal proportion to the total number of businesses. There are certainly a few places that have higher percentages of businesses that are restaurants and bars. It's just that in most regions, the percentage of total businesses that are restaurants and bars is pretty similar. The other two categories of businesses that provide something to do, that is arts and recreation and music and bookstores, had higher levels of geographic concentration back in 1990. In other words, some regions had relatively higher location quotients in these industries, while other places had location quotients of close to zero. You might recall that location quotients are a measure of the extent to which a region has a specialization in a given sector of the economy. And when I looked at regions at the top of the list for businesses that provide something to do, I found that 53 of the 381 metropolitan areas studied are in the top 20 for at least one of the three categories of arts and recreation, restaurants and bars, and music and bookstores. But when scanning the top 20 lists, I noticed a lot of metropolitan areas that rely heavily on tourism, places such as Ocean City, Myrtle Beach, and Las Vegas. So with all of that as a backdrop, let's look at the relationship between the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas and businesses that provide something to do. This figure summarizes the effects of arts and recreation businesses, restaurants and bars, and book and music stores on the growth of good jobs. The height of the bars represents the size of the impact on overall economic development in terms of standard deviations when we increase the percentage of a region's businesses in the category by one standard deviation. As an example, the middle bar, which is labeled as restaurants and bars, tells us that a one standard deviation increase in a metropolitan area's percentage of businesses that are restaurants and bars corresponds with about a 0.25 standard deviation decrease in the economic development index. The bars are shaded in red to indicate results that are statistically significant. So these results tell us that regions with specializations in arts and recreation businesses and restaurants and bars actually performed worse for the growth of good jobs between 1990 and the mid-2010s. But you might recall that the Economic Development Index is a combination of the employment growth, income, and employment persistence indices, where employment persistence is a measure of the ups and downs or fluctuations in employment over time. And you might also recall from a much earlier video that places with lots of tourists might be subject to lower levels of employment persistence, especially if the region has a peak tourism season with fewer visitors during the rest of the year. If you pull all of this together, it suggests that businesses that provide something to do, because they're often located in tourism-oriented regions, might be associated with lower levels of employment persistence. And this figure confirms this type of intuition. Now, the height of the bars represents the size of the impact on employment persistence in terms of standard deviations when we increase the percentage of a region's businesses in the category by one standard deviation. And for all three types of businesses that provide something to do, we find negative and statistically significant effects on the employment persistence of U.S. metropolitan areas. With all that in mind, we can summarize the relationship between the economic development of U.S. regions and businesses that provide something to do. First, we find that these types of businesses are negatively associated with the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas. And as it turns out, these impacts are mostly due to the low employment persistence of tourism-oriented regions. So now let's summarize the types of amenities that we have considered so far. We looked at climate as measured by January temperature in the previous video, and in this video we've thought about crime rates, which is a disamenity, and now businesses that provide something to do. So we've looked at a handful of different amenity variables, but what if we could come up with a single overall indicator of amenities? Well, as it turns out, we can. And to come up with a single measure of amenities, we'll use the hedonic approach to analyzing amenities. You might recall that the hedonic approach to amenities is based on the premise that amenities are priced into local labor and housing markets. So places with high housing prices relative to incomes are believed to be amenity rich. This means that we can use data on housing values and incomes to actually calculate a measure of amenities. This scatter plot has housing values on the y-axis and median incomes on the x-axis. The upward sloping trend line, which is actually a curve, shows the positive relationship between housing values and incomes, and points on the line represent the predicted value of housing for a given amount of income. If a point is above the curve, it means that housing values are more expensive given the region's income. In other words, people are accepting lower wages and are paying higher housing costs to live in these regions, presumably at least in part due to the amenities. And the points that are farthest above the curve are assumed to have the highest amenities, and points below the curve have less desirable amenities. In the figure, you see that the points for San Luis Obispo, Santa Cruz, Honolulu, and Barnstable, Mass., that's Cape Cod, are well above the curve, and these places are certainly celebrated for their amenities. Here's a list of the top 10 U.S. metropolitan areas for amenities based on the results of the previous scatter plot. You might recall from an earlier video that this approach to measuring amenities very much favored places in California. Also, I should point out that this list has an almost 100% overlap with the places identified as high amenities by Edward Glazer and colleagues. So I used the information from the scatter plot of housing values and incomes to calculate an overall amenity score for all 381 U.S. metropolitan areas that I studied, and I did the same thing for states. Here's a summary of the relationship between the Economic Development Index, which is a combination of the Employment Index, Income Index, and Employment Persistence Index, and the amenity score. The height of the bars represents the size of the impact in terms of standard deviations when we increase the amenity measure by 1 standard deviation. And I shade the bars to indicate results that are statistically significant. Since none of the bars are shaded, it means that I did not find a statistically significant relationship between the growth of good jobs and the indicator of overall amenities in a region. This result holds in an analysis of states, U.S. metropolitan areas, and subsets of large and small U.S. metros. To summarize the analysis in the previous figure, we first used data on housing values and incomes to tell us the places with an abundance of amenities. And we use these results to come up with a measure of the overall amenities in a place. Second, we examined the effects of this overall amenity variable on the economic development of U.S. regions. And we found that amenity-rich areas fared no better or worse than other places in terms of the growth of good jobs. Should these results be surprising? They might be to some, but not if you think in terms of the hedonic approach to examining amenities. That is, if amenities are already priced into housing costs and incomes, they're less apt to impact growth or development. As always, let's end with a few key takeaways. And since we had 2 videos about amenities, these takeaways will cover both videos. First, we learned that a pleasant climate, measured in terms of warm winter temperatures, has a positive effect on the economic development of U.S. regions, particularly employment growth and employment persistence. Second, we learned that the non-climate amenities, and here we looked at low crime and businesses that provide something to do, have no effect or even a negative association with economic development. And to end things, here's a bonus takeaway about amenities and economic development. Even after we learned about the impacts of amenities on the growth of good jobs, don't sleep on the importance of amenities. The mere fact that people are willing to pay for amenities through higher housing costs and accepting lower wages means that people place a tremendous value on living around amenities. It's just that because we're interested in employment growth and income, we're not detecting a positive impact of amenities on our measure of economic development. Take it from me, I recently visited San Luis Obispo, California, which is our top metro for amenities, and that place is perfect. Proximity to mountains and the coast, perfect weather, and great restaurants. Wow.